My name is Jim Armbruster. I'm the Field Research Coordinator at the Vermont Institute of Natural Science, or VINS for short. Like Sarah said, we'll do some quick Zoom etiquette. So if you'd like your screens turned off, that's down at the bottom left corner usually. Just kind of hover there. You can see the mute button and the video off button. You should be muted when you came in, but just make sure you don't bump yourself off mute by accident. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You can send them directly to me or the group chat, either way. And then we'll jump in to Neil's presentation with some questions as there's some time. And there'll also be time at the end for questions as well. But really quickly, I always like to ask people that if they've been to VINS before and they raise their hands, and I see who's been to VINS, but I can only see half of you. So I'll just assume everyone's been to VINS before. You all know what a great place it is. But if you haven't, that's okay too. We encourage you to come visit us. We are a nonprofit nature center down in Quechee, Vermont, and we have all sorts of things going on our campus, from daily programming with our resident ambassador raptors and reptiles. We have educational exhibits that include resident to Vermont raptors and some other species that you might not find in our state. We have a new walk-through songbird aviary where you can see some non-releasable songbirds. You get to walk right in and see them behaving naturally as they would out in the wild. And we also have a canopy walk, which you can walk out and be at the tops of the trees in our forest. So a lot of cool things happening at our nature center down in Quechee. And we say that our mission is to motivate people to care about the environment, and we do that through our education, our research, and our avian wildlife rehabilitation. You're all participating in our educational part of our mission. You're here to learn something from Neil about a really exciting project that he's got going on. We also have, like I said, those on-site programs with our raptor birds. We take those birds on the road with us to area schools, libraries, different events. And we also have educators present in schools in our area enhancing their STEM programs. We do a lot of education. It's kind of our main focus with our organization. The avian wildlife rehabilitation is a fancy way of saying we have a bird hospital on our campus. People in Vermont and parts of New Hampshire know to bring us their sick, injured, orphan birds, and they get fixed up hopefully by the staff there and released back out into the wild if they're healthy enough to do so. And they actually have about a 40% success rate when it comes to releasing those birds, which is the higher side of the national average. And we actually see about 1,000 birds a year now. So they're very busy over there, really proud of the work that they do. And it's a great way to teach people also about the problems that these birds are facing. And the research, that's what I'm involved in. We do all sorts of field studies, from monitoring our extensive network of American kestrel nesting boxes. We're actually banned the adults and the nestlings in the box network. We're right now looking for broadwing hawk nests throughout the state. And we also, in the spring and summer, we will start tagging monarch butterflies. So we do all sorts of different field work at VINS as well. And part of our research is collaborative. So we've worked with Neil actually in a small part of his larger project looking at rough-legged hawks. VINS was actually able to fund a few transmitters in his study. He actually donated several that he had as well to go to the Vermont effort as he's studying these rough-legged hawks throughout their entire range. So a few years back, he mentioned that he was heading east with his work and kind of slowly making his way across the country. And I happened to catch that, and I reached out to him and thought what a really cool, exciting project to bring to Vermont. So that's kind of how Neil is somewhat connected to VINS and what we do here. So yep, someone came off mute there.
Can't hear him, right?
With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Neil. Neil is a former conservation biologist for HawkWatch International, and he's a current PhD student candidate at the University of Idaho. So take it away, Neil.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim. Really excited to be here, everyone. As Jim said, my name is Neil Paprocki. Currently a PhD student at University of Idaho. I'm going to talk to you today about roughly 10 years of collaborative research that we've been doing on rough-legged hawks in North America. Towards the end of the talk, I'm going to touch more specifically on Vermont and the work we did in Vermont now 2 winters ago. With the birds that we've tracked from Vermont, but I'll kind of get to that at the end of the talk, but we'll somewhat go in chronological order here. As Jim said, if questions come up, enter them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them kind of as we go to break things up a little bit. But yeah, it's going to be all rough-legged hawks today. And I just wanted to start by saying, I'm the one talking here today, but this whole project and effort over the last 10 years has been like a massive collaborative effort. VINS has been involved, like Jim said, a whole bunch of our other organizations have been involved. I can't even fit everyone on one slide, so I have to have 2 slides of acknowledgements. But I just want to say that, you know, it's not just me here. Lots of other folks have helped immensely along the way to put together the effort that we've been able to do here. A little bit of background first about the rough-legged hawk. Here's one picture here on the breeding grounds in Alaska. You can see their kind of characteristic dark wrist patches and dark belly band that is so often associated with a lot of individuals of this species. Here's their range map. So they're a bird that's found around the world. So this is their North American range map, but they're also found in Eurasia as well. And they breed at high latitudes, mostly in the Arctic, but also subarctic as well. So yeah, circumpolar breeding distribution, primarily north of tree line. They nest primarily on cliffs and rocky outcrops, but they also nest on the ground in some places, particularly when prey abundance is very high. And they're a complete migrant. So what does that mean? It means, you know, 100% of the individuals in the population migrate and totally vacate the breeding range during winter and come down to their non-breeding range, which is shown in blue here, and of course includes Vermont as well. A little more background information. Rough-legged hawks are primarily an open country bird. They use grassland habitats, shrub habitats, agricultural areas, wetlands in the winter, and then of course in the summer, they are primarily found in tundra habitats. What we know about their diet is that they're primarily a small mammal specialist. I'm going to talk a little bit more about diet towards the end of the talk because we're doing some work there. But what folks have found before, primarily a small mammal specialist, but we also know they take birds. We also know that they occasionally scavenge, particularly in the winter, and they're bound to take some other prey as well. So my work with rough-legged hawks started way back, 10 years ago now, when I was doing my master's work at Boise State University. And what we did is we were primarily focused on Western North America at the time, but we used Christmas bird count data. Hopefully many folks on the call here participated in a Christmas bird count. It's a wonderful way to contribute to science. It's just a fantastic long-term data set. It's a count that takes place kind of in midwinter for those folks who aren't aware. And it's been going on for well over 100 years now. But we analyzed about 35 years worth of Christmas bird count data, and we looked at 6 different raptor species, and we were looking to see if there had been any distribution shifts over time. And so, how did we do that? You can look over on this map here, and I'm just using rough-legged hawks as an example. This orange dot here might kind of be like the center of that species wintering range, and you might have something that looks like a bell curve around that, where towards the northern edge of their winter range, you don't see that many birds. You get into kind of that core winter range and there's a lot more birds. And then you get to the southern end of their range. And again, you start to see fewer birds. And so we were looking at kind of that center of mass of their winter range and seeing if that was shifting at all over time. So is it, is that moving south or is it moving north? What were we going to find there? So for rough-legged hawks, and this paper was published in the journal PLOS ONE. It's open access. You can Google this title and it'll come up and you can access the paper. But so this is just for rough-legged hawks. We found a substantial northern shift in their winter distribution over the course of that 35-year period. About 3 degrees latitude, which is about 200 miles. So that's no real trivial shift in their distribution, and pretty consistently shifting that distribution further north over time. At the same time, we were also seeing declines in the overall population abundance of rough-legged hawks during that time. But this negative population trend that you see on the right here may be somewhat influenced by that northward distribution shifts, in that some hawks may be shifting outside of the survey coverage zone. Like they're now wintering so far north that there's not really very many Christmas bird count circles up there to count them. And so that's something we wanted to look at a bit more. And so we did that in this paper, and essentially what we found is that, how do we monitor raptor populations, right? Like we use some of these really large scale long-term data sets like the Christmas bird count, like the breeding bird survey, and we use these to try to put a finger on the pulse of like, well, how are raptor and bird populations doing generally? But if raptors are shifting their distributions around, but the survey locations are staying static, these population trends that you can see might be partially influenced by those distribution shifts. So it's something you need to keep in mind. And so what we also did for my master's work, this is another paper that came out of that, is that we did a local study just in Southwest Idaho, where we looked at rough-legged hawks and other raptors over the course of about 20 years, and how their numbers were changing in just a local area, and could that be related to these larger scale distribution shifts that we were seeing. And we wanted to look at the types of habitats that birds were using over time. And this figure is kind of gnarly here, but let's see if anything gets circled. Yeah, we'll just circle in on here. But these different color lines are just different time periods, like 20 years ago versus now. And essentially what we found is that over the course of this 20-year period, rough-legged hawks were increasing in abundance in our local study area. And they were also changing a bit the types of habitats that they were using. So they were using more invasive grassland habitats, like cheatgrass is what we have here in the West. So this to us was suggesting that, they have some flexibility in their wintering habitat use, which is a good thing because we know habitat's changing, and if birds are shifting their distributions, they might need to find different types of habitats to use. So that's encouraging. And so primarily what we found here from my master's work is that, habitat is continuing to change, obviously. And some raptors show some flexibility in the habitats that they do use, which is good. And the local raptor changes that we were seeing in Idaho anyway, were most likely being influenced by these distribution shifts that we were seeing, which are likely being facilitated by warmer winters and climate change. And so for rough-legged hawks, the species is wintering further north, primarily because of reduced migration distances. But for other species, it might be individuals just aren't even migrating at all anymore, or a smaller proportion of them are not migrating. So this was primarily, my master's work was primarily focused in the West. A couple years later, we wanted to follow up on this by looking at Christmas bird count numbers across all of North America, and kind of see if the findings we were seeing in Western North America were holding true at a larger spatial scale. So here's a map from that analysis. It's got pretty much, it's not all the Christmas bird count circles, but it's like long-term Christmas bird count circles that have been surveying consistently for like at least 20 years. And overall, we found a negative population trend for rough-legged hawks, which again is potentially concerning. And we saw that trend got more negative the further east you went, but the trend got more positive the further north you went. And so this latter finding that the trends are increasing further north is consistent with our previous finding that birds are shifting their distributions further north. That declining trend as you move east is a little concerning, and we wanted to look kind of even more into that. And so we also looked at migration count data. There's not a lot of migration counts that count rough-legged hawks in significant numbers, but we wanted to look at them anyway. And so this is what we found for the various migration sites that count, enough rough-legged hawks that we can do some kind of trend analysis. And again, we found an overall negative trend, which again is concerning and consistent with what we were seeing with the Christmas bird count data. That trend was getting more negative as you went further east. And so again, that seems like, that there may be something going on in the east with rough-legged hawks really kind of showing the strongest negative declines as you move east. And there's, I'm not really going to talk about why that might be, but there's a number of reasons why that might be. But again, like what is the status of rough-legged hawks in North America? We don't have a lot of great data from their breeding range because they breed in the Arctic. It's very hard to survey up there. And so we're using this Christmas bird count and migration data to try to get a handle on what the population status is of the species. And even though their distributions are shifting further north, I think there's pretty compelling evidence here that there is a possible long-term decline in the species, which, there's a lot of bird species that are declining. And there's lots of different reasons for why that might be happening. And so why might that be happening in rough-legged hawks? Well, to focus on the breeding grounds first, there's been some research done in Eastern North America and also in Europe on breeding rough-legged hawks that have some implications here for maybe, potential causes of population declines. One is a paper here that I'm showing, so kind of a direct cause of decline. There's this increased likelihood of nest collapse and failure now in the Arctic due to climate change, creating more unstable nesting substrates. So oftentimes rough-legged hawks are nesting on rocky outcrops or sometimes like cut riverbanks that aren't like cliffs, they're just like cut earth. And so permafrost is warming and melting and creating more unstable nesting substrates. And this paper was finding a pretty substantial increase in the amount of nest collapse and failure due to these more unstable ground conditions that are being somewhat caused by climate change. Indirectly, this is another paper, changing prey dynamics in the Arctic associated with reduced prey populations caused by climate change, reducing the breeding success of particularly small mammals, which we know rough-legged hawks, primarily specialize. So for small mammals, warmer and wetter winters are associated with reduced overwinter survival and reproduction. So these northern small mammals actually survive better and reproduce more in winter, and they will reproduce in winter when there's a thick layer of insulating snow under which they can kind of flourish and be active and all that good stuff. So there's some climate change implications here that might be kind of destabilizing the population dynamics of rough-legged hawk prey on the breeding grounds. So we know of a couple things going on here in the breeding grounds. A lot of it, is being climate change is being implicated in a lot of this. But there's also possible mechanisms of population decline that are not associated with the breeding season that are taking place at other times of the year. And this is just kind of like a basic life cycle map that's a little more detailed than what you might normally see. But we don't have a great understanding of like how climate change might be contributing to non-breeding season dynamics. We know it might be shifting birds distributions further north, but like, what does that mean? Is that good or bad? But essentially, like we needed better knowledge here of the full annual cycle of rough-legged hawks, particularly of their movement patterns. And one really excellent way of, getting at this is that we have this technology now that these tracking units that we can put on birds and track their movements and survival in really fine detail. And that's where our movement ecology study came in. And pictured here is Jeff Kidd, who initiated this rough-legged hawk movement study in 2014, and he's my primary collaborator as well. So Jeff is the one that kind of kicked this all off. He started putting transmitters on rough-legged hawks in California and Nevada, and then things have just kind of expanded from there. And I'm privileged to be a part of this project now as we've really grown it. Prior to this study,
Neil.
Yep.
Hey, so then before we get too far into this, there was a question about rodenticide potentially. Have you seen any of that affecting populations?
Yeah, good question. So rodenticides, the short answer is no / I don't know. Rodenticides we're still like barely grasping and understanding the impact that rodenticides may have on raptors and which raptors. Certainly we know that raptors can die from rodenticides, but we don't know what kind of like population level effect that might be having. We don't really have a good handle on that for rough-legged hawks. I will say, and I'll talk a bit more about kind of mortality that we've seen in rough-legged hawks, but we have not directly implicated rodenticides in any of our rough-legged hawk mortalities that we've seen. But rodenticides are also difficult to implicate because there's many different kinds of them. How they manifest physiologically in the body is like very different and can be highly variable. So it's often difficult to tell if a bird dies from rodenticide poisoning, but we haven't seen that yet in rough-legged hawks, which might partly be due to the fact that rough-legged hawks are often hanging out in places that are further away from people and human development. I think a lot of times we see rodenticide poisoning in like more highly populated areas, not all the time, but more. So that's a long-winded answer of, basically we don't really know, although based on our current knowledge, we don't suspect rodenticide as being like a strong, potential driver of rough-legged hawk mortality or population declines. But yeah, great question. Keep the questions coming. I'm happy to answer them as we go. So prior to our movement study, very little was known about rough-legged hawk movements and migration. They were known to kind of be these unconventional migrants that used valleys or more open country habitats. Relatively few of them are counted at most raptor migration sites. There are some sites in the east that are kind of exceptions to this. And there had only been one other tracking study done on rough-legged hawks, which took place in Japan on birds that were wintering in Japan. They tracked 4 birds. Most of them went up into Russia, but we didn't have really any understanding of their movements and migration in North America. So what have we done? Well, since 2014, we've put out almost 200 transmitters on rough-legged hawks, so we're still going. I actually don't, for the first time in like years, I don't actually have a transmitter with me, but we're still putting them out. We put out more this winter. We're putting them on all age classes, both sexes. Initially, we were really heavily focused on Western North America. That's just kind of where we were. It was easy to get them out. That's where we were based and that's where we focused, but we've since kind of moved around to cover pretty much their entire North American distribution. And I'm just going to show a few pictures of what these GPS transmitters look like on the birds. That we've used a bunch of different kinds of transmitters. This is one that you can see here. Here's myself putting a transmitter on a bird in Idaho. This transmitter has an antenna, so it looks quite a bit different. Here's what another transmitter looks like. These transmitters weigh less than 30 grams. Most of them weigh in the neighborhood of 21 to 25 grams, which represents less than 3% of the bird's body weight, which 3% is kind of the cutoff that us researchers use. We want the transmitters to be less than 3% of the bird's body weight, because that's kind of been shown that if you can get it less than that, you're much less likely to affect the bird's behavior or survival or things like that. So we try to keep the transmitters as light as possible so it doesn't have any deleterious effects on the birds. The transmitters have the potential to last a long time. They don't always last a long time, but we've had, I think we still have one transmitter from like 2014 or 2015 that's still going. So that thing's been going for like 8 or 9 years. That's not typical. Typically they last like 1 to 3 years. But we have had a few transmitters last like more than 5 years, which is pretty incredible. The transmitters have solar panels on them, so they're like continuously recharging these little tiny batteries that are in there. But the batteries get old over time, solar panels get dirty, whatnot. So typically the transmitters just kind of fade over time. Here's another transmitter. This is a bird caught in Alaska on the breeding grounds. Most of the birds we've captured have been wintering birds, but we have done some breeding work as well in Alaska and also in Canada on the west side of Hudson Bay, and also on Violet Island as well, some collaborators. But primarily we're tagging wintering birds here. And this is most of our movement data. This is 173 birds, most of our birds, and pretty much all of them are shown here. These tracks are colored by date. So older tracks are like purple and blue, and the more recent tracks are green and yellow. So you can clearly see that we've kind of shifted our focus further east over time, and put a lot more focus in Eastern North America over the last couple of years. but we have a greater concentration of data from the west, just because that's kind of where the project was started, and we've been able to put more transmitters out on western birds. And in a lot of places, there's higher densities of birds in the west too. I could talk about this slide for a long time because it's just like really cool to look at. But you can kind of see some really major migratory concentration areas, particularly this like river of color here that goes on the east side of the Rockies through Alberta and up into, these are birds that are primarily going to Alaska. You can see some of the routes that these birds are taking around the Great Lakes. And down here at the very southern end here, so we have not yet had a bird go to Mexico, but we had a bird get within like 5 kilometers of the Mexico border before it turned around. And kind of interesting when you look at this map, it's surprising to me, but we have never had a bird go to Russia or Europe. Europe is maybe less surprising, but these birds are very capable of making that crossing across the Bering Sea to go into Russia, but we have never had a bird go to Russia. Certainly, I'm sure that they do sometimes, but we just haven't seen it yet. Anyway, so this is kind of what we found, and just some really simple summary stuff, things that we've learned so far. Sorry, this is their range map again, just so you can kind of see we're pretty much covering their whole range. They don't really winter in the southeast here, and that's represented in our movement database. So we know a heck of a lot more about timing, duration, distances that these birds migrate, as well as migratory connectivity, especially in the West. These are just some real basic, like, descriptive statistics. So in the fall, the average start date for adults in the West is late September. And this is interesting, right? Like if you guys are familiar with migration, like most migration sites in the fall, late September is like the peak of migration. Birds are like mid-migration, and rough-legged hawks haven't even started yet. They're still up in the Arctic. And then they don't even really get down to their breeding ground or to their wintering ranges until November, sometimes even December. It's about a month and a half, and these Western birds, straight line distance, are going about 2,000 miles. In the spring, they're initiating in late March. A lot of birds initiate in early April as well. And our Western birds get to the breeding grounds a bit earlier than our Eastern birds. Some are getting to the breeding grounds in late April. So some of them are already there, but kind of on average, it's the 10th of May. And just to kind of note here, like the farthest distance we've had a bird cover in a single day is about 700 kilometers, which is 435 miles. We've had a couple birds do this a few times. They average about 100 to 200 kilometers per day during migration when they're actively moving. And then just a little bit on how this compares to birds in the East. Just phenologically speaking, in terms of timing, we have less data on Eastern birds still, but fall start date is similar, maybe a little bit earlier, end date's later. So it seems like, I'm just going to throw up spring here too, but birds, compared to Western birds, Eastern birds are migrating shorter distances, and the migration is more protracted. So they're taking longer to move a shorter distance. But there's still a lot of similarities in the timing and whatnot between Eastern and Western birds. So, what are we doing with all this movement data? We got like over 1 million GPS points from these almost 200 birds. Well, part of it is feeding into my dissertation at the University of Idaho. And I'm just going to like very, very briefly touch on what I'm doing for my dissertation. But I am really interested in, for my dissertation, is why different individual birds migrate different distances, right? So we have some birds that winter in like North Dakota, really far north, really cold. They don't migrate very far. We have other birds that winter in North Texas, much, much further south, like 1,000 miles further south, much warmer. They migrate a lot further. So why is that? Why do we see this variation in how far individual birds migrate? And I'm testing these 7 hypotheses here to try to better understand like why are birds migrating different distances. And I'm not going to get into the details of all of these, but there's several of these hypotheses that have a lot to do with food, and particularly food during the winter. So that, just for an example, there's this diet specialization hypothesis, like different birds prefer different types of food, or they're maybe capable of catching different types of food because they're different sizes or whatever, or they have different foraging tactics. But for a couple of these, like we need to understand what they're eating during the winter. I already mentioned that we know they're primarily a small mammal specialist, but that doesn't mean that there is an individual variation among birds, and some birds are eating different stuff. And so we really wanted to get a better handle on winter diet, which there have been some studies on winter diet, but generally not much is known about their diet in the winter. And so, how are we getting at this? Well, we're using this technique called DNA metabarcoding, where we're looking at prey remains from the bird. And I'm just going to kind of briefly show you how this DNA metabarcoding works. So here's a rough-legged hawk up close. This is it's like in my hand, right here. And you can see there's a bunch of stuff on the bird's bill. Old, dried blood, bits of fur. These are remains from stuff that the bird has been eating probably fairly recently. I just have a picture of a small mammal up here. Maybe that's what it was eating. But there's genetic material on these prey remains on the bird's beak, right? And so there's DNA on there. So what do? Well, when we catch birds, we take all these different samples from the birds when we catch them. And for each hawk that we've captured, we've taken swabs from their talons, from their beak, from the inside of their mouth, from their cloaca, sorry birds, and we've also collected poop samples. Like we've watched birds perched, we watch them defecate, and then we go and collect a poop sample off the ground. All of these different things contain genetic material from the prey that the birds have been eating. And so we can take these samples back to a genetics lab. They can amplify that DNA, and then we can sequence the DNA and try to match the sequences we find to sequences in genetic databases. A lot of taxa across the world has been sequenced already, and so we can try to match these sequences we're seeing on the birds to get a better sense of what they're eating. And I don't have any Vermont specific results to show you, but we just ran some we just got some pilot results back from our diet data. And so I'm super excited to show you guys this stuff because I think it's really exciting. But it's just data from 10 birds. The Vermont birds, we should know potentially this summer, in the next couple months, we'll have a better handle on what those Vermont birds were eating. But this graph shows you kind of the diet distribution of 10 birds that we ran some pilot data on. And, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of colors, which essentially means we're seeing a lot of different stuff that they're eating, which is cool. But the biggest chunk that we're seeing, this big chunk in the middle here, is voles, mice, and rats, which is what we are expecting to be the largest proportion of their diet. And so that's good that we're seeing that. This technique that we're using seems to be identifying what we already know to be the main food source for these birds. But we're also seeing other cool stuff, like some birds. We're seeing some squirrels, we're seeing some rabbits, things like that. And so this is just for all birds pooled together. But we can also break this down by individual bird and see, what differences are we seeing in diet among individual birds. And so these are 10 different birds here. Each one of these bars represents a single bird. And you can, again, this largest chunk here for most of these birds is mostly voles, which again is what we expect. But some interesting variation here, right? These 2 birds on the right, one of them had just oodles of pocket gopher DNA on it. And then this bird over here had a bunch of bird DNA. And these are all family level prey assignments here that I'm showing you guys, which is cool. But we can actually do better than that taxonomically with our prey assignments. And so this is essentially the same figure. Each of these each of these 10 birds is a bar, but now we're down really like as fine scale taxonomically as we can get with our prey assignments. And again, mostly small mammals, but like some really interesting stuff, like this bird on the far right over here, which was a bird captured in South Dakota, tons of pheasant DNA. This bird also had a little bit of beaver DNA. I imagine it's probably scavenging that beaver. We saw some deer on a few birds, which again, probably scavenging. Well, not probably, like they're definitely scavenging deer. There's no way they're taking deer. And then, you know, some songbirds too, like horned lark. So just really like, I'm really excited about this. I think it's really cool. And we've done this for literally every single bird we've captured the last 3 years, which is over 100 birds. So once we get all this diet data back this summer, we're going to have like a really firm grasp on rough-legged hawk diet during winter and how that varies among individuals and how that might be related to their migratory behavior in terms of like where they winter. And again, pretty soon we'll have some data back from the Vermont birds, which I'm excited to see. And speaking of Vermont, now I'm going to get into some kind of Vermont specific stuff from the work that we did with Vins. So here's me and Jim trapping rough-legged hawks 2 winters ago. It was pretty darn cold this day. I don't remember what the temperature was, but it was cold and windy. But Vins was great to work with. I mean, like Jim said, they supplied money for a few transmitters, and I brought a couple of my own. And over the course of 3 days, we caught 5 rough-legged hawks and put transmitters on all 5 birds. I just have a couple more pictures here, just to embarrass Jim a little bit. Here he is holding. This might be the first bird we caught or the second bird. I can't remember, but Jim looks pretty excited. It's about as excited as Jim gets, I think, but he was pretty stoked. I was excited too. And this is Kirsty, who was working with Jim at the time. Just a few of the birds we caught. You know, it's the birds don't have a fun time when we're doing this, but it sure is exciting for us to be able, because we work really hard to catch these birds, and nice to put a transmitter on them and then let them go and kind of see what happens. You can see the transmitter on this bird's back right here. So these are the 5 birds that we caught in Vermont and put GPS transmitters on. A nice mix of birds. We had 3 juvenile females, which are all pictured on the right here. And then we had these 2 dark morphs. This is a 2nd-year male in the top left, and then an adult female on the bottom left. So a nice mix of birds. And we'll just get into kind of the movements that we saw from these birds. So this map here shows all the movements we've gotten from all 5 of those transmitters. There's a blue line here that you can't really see. It's kind of buried. But so this is all the data we've gotten so far from these 5. And I want to get into all of these kind of in a bit more detail, particularly because, like, you know, Vins is really interested in what these birds are doing on the wintering grounds in Vermont. And so this is movement data from 2 birds that pretty much stayed in Vermont all winter. One of them is one of the juvenile females, which is shown in red in the upper left. And then the bird in blue on the lower right was that really nice dark morph adult female. So we're you know, near Middlebury here is where we were kind of centered in.
Neil, could you explain really briefly how there was a question in the chat, how you actually trap these birds?
Yeah, for sure.
And how the transmitters are affixed to them.
Yes, great question. Let me back up here. Kind of hard to see how the transmitters are affixed, but that's okay. So how do we catch the birds? Well, again, we know these birds are small mammal specialists, right? And they're pretty food motivated in the wintertime. So we use a trap called a ball shotry trap, which maybe like at the end, I'll go run and get one. There's one in the other room I can show people, but it's just a small metal cage, wire cage. And inside the cage, we put a live mouse. The mouse is protected in the cage. The mouse doesn't get hurt or anything like that. And we look for birds that are preferably perched, and we put this trap out in front of the birds, or, you know, we don't actually have to get it very close to the birds because they have like really good eyesight. Sometimes we're a couple hundred yards away from the birds when we put the traps out. The birds see the mouse, they come down to the trap. On top of the trap, we have a bunch of monofilament nooses that are made out of fishing line. And so the bird is like on top of the cage that the mouse is in, and it's footing the cage with its feet, trying to get at the mouse, but it can't get to the mouse, but it's trying to. And there's all these nooses on top. And so the bird's feet get tangled in those nooses. And then when it tries to fly away, the trap is weighted so that the bird can't fly away with the trap. And the bird's caught on the trap. And then we're like right there, and we're on it within seconds to grab the bird off the trap. And that's how we catch them. And then the transmitters are put onto the bird. So the transmitter sits on the bird's back, like in between their shoulder blades. And we use a Teflon harness that is basically like a backpack. So there's two straps that come over the bird's shoulders. And then there's two straps that come like under the bird's wing and around their midsection. And then those straps meet on the bird's keel. And that's where it gets to fix. So it's basically like the bird's wearing a really small backpack, and it just, the transmitter sits on the bird's back like that. But great questions. Our trapping technique only works if birds are hungry. Sometimes the birds aren't hungry and they don't come down to the trap and we don't catch them. We learned a little bit about that this past winter. So yeah, that's how we catch them. So yeah, here's those, let's see, I'll get these movements from all the birds. And then, yeah, we're kind of zooming in on these two birds that basically stayed in Vermont all winter. So this is that adult female. This is her winter range. I mean, this is like thousands of locations over the course of several months. And you kind of notice the scale bar here, like this bird didn't move very far. But what's interesting here, and we see this in a lot of our birds, this area that I've circled here in white, this is her typical roosting location, like where she would go at night. She would go into these trees to roost. And then during the day, kind of north of the highway here is where she would spend most of her time foraging. And there's this parallel road here. This is where we actually caught her. So we kind of caught her right on the edge of her winter territory here. This is that other bird that stayed in Vermont all winter. This is one of those juvenile females. Really similar looking winter territory. Again, she was like roosting down here and then kind of foraging in some more like open fields. We often see birds roosting at night slightly disjunct from where they forage during the day. Sometimes they move several kilometers between roosting and foraging locations. These birds weren't moving very far. And then contrasting that to the other three birds that we caught, these other three birds that I'm showing here, they moved a lot more after we caught them. And they were moving, 1 to 250 kilometers further south, typically into eastern New York and the Hudson Valley. This white area is kind of our study area where we caught all 5 of those birds. So these birds moved around quite a bit more. And zooming in on these ones a little bit, this is one of those young females. She went down to Hudson, New York, and spent time in kind of like 2 different places primarily, which was neat. This was a bird that did the most moving around during winter. Another one of those young females. She spent a good chunk of time in this like pretty small clearing here, surrounded by forests near Pine Plains, New York. And then this same bird also went over to Rome, New York in late February and early March and spent some time at the airport, about a week and a half on the edge of the Rome airport, which is always we always get a little nervous. Like they don't spend a lot of time at airports, but there's collision risks with airplanes and whatnot. So we get a little nervous when birds start spending time at airports. And our last bird here, this is our second year male. He went kind of back and forth between Vermont and the Fort Edward grasslands near Glens Falls, New York, which is where we're shown here. I meant to have this picture come up later, but Glens Falls is just right behind this photo here. So this is a pretty well-known grassland area that folks frequent quite a bit. And this bird was actually photographed by a photographer that had no idea the bird was there. I think he posted it to Facebook or something, and we caught onto it at some point. But this is the bird. You can see the antenna sticking out here. So it's always kind of cool when we see folks, when folks photograph our birds, and we get to see that like transmitter looks great, bird's doing its thing, doing good. So a little bit, we're going to get a little sad here for a second, which, you know, I'll bring things back up at the end. But, you know, unfortunately, these 5 birds that we captured, 4 of them ended up dying in the spring and summer. The 2 birds that I'm showing here died in April of 2022, and their deaths were confirmed to be the direct result of avian influenza. And this circled area is where the 2 birds died. So they died kind of along the St. Lawrence River in southern Quebec. They almost certainly contracted influenza in Quebec and died rather quickly. We know raptors typically die pretty quickly when they contract influenza. We don't know exactly how they contracted influenza, but possibly from scavenging dead waterfowl that had the disease. And I'll touch more on this influenza stuff here in a second. So these birds were lost in April, kind of as they were just starting to make their way north on spring migration. Things get a little more interesting with 2 of our young females that we had transmitters on, shown here. They survived spring, and they both made extensive travels into rough-legged hawk breeding range in Quebec and Labrador. You can see some of their movements up here. But both of them came all the way back south into southern Quebec. And I've circled their locations here where they ended up. And they both died in late June. We weren't able to confirm cause of death for these 2 birds. They were too like desiccated by the time we got to them, just because it was June and hot and like things decompose super fast. But we, again, strongly suspect influenza as a cause of death for these 2 birds, but we couldn't really confirm that for these 2. So, you know, really unfortunate that, you know, our trip to Vermont kind of coincided with this outbreak of influenza. I think we would have had much higher survival and success rate if we had, you know, gone in a different year when influenza wasn't a thing. And this, you know, this is a sad topic, but really, like, one of the most important things that transmitters can provide us with is an opportunity to learn where, when, and how birds die. And so this map here is just kind of a subset of mortalities that we've seen, showing the locations and like season within the annual cycle for 26 mortalities that we found in more of our Eastern focused work that we've been doing in the last 5 years or so. You can see that, you know, a lot of these mortalities have occurred during spring migration, and to maybe a slightly lesser degree during winter as well. There's a notable kind of clump of deaths here up in kind of the North Dakota area, and this other clump here in the St. Lawrence Seaway. These are all of the Vermont birds over here along the St. Lawrence River. But we were able to ascertain some information regarding the cause of death for 18 of these 26 mortalities, which is what this map is showing. So again, the locations of the mortalities are shown along with the cause of death. And you can really, I think the thing that jumps out the most is that we had heavy losses in the Great Plains and also the St. Lawrence Seaway during last spring of 2022 from avian influenza, with 8 confirmed influenza deaths. We've had an additional, I think, 3 confirmed influenza deaths since then that are not shown on this map. And additionally, we have all these unknown deaths that we can't confirm, and we suspect another 4 or 5 of these 8 were from influenza as well during the spring of 2022. So really, like, I mean, man, raptors really got the short end of the stick the last couple of years with avian influenza. I think it's probably contributed significantly to like the low numbers of raptors that folks were seeing in a lot of the East this winter. I think that's a part of it. But we've had birds die from other factors as well. From predation, we've had like great horned owl predations. birds dying from bacterial infections. Unfortunately, we do see birds get shot periodically by humans. And then we also have up here, way up north in Hudson Bay, we had a bird like just try to fly across like the middle of Hudson Bay and died trying to do so, like fell into the water and died. So, this is all rather depressing, but we really get a really great handle on how, when, and where these birds are dying, which is really important information for us to know if we're going to try to understand like what's causing these potential population declines and how the birds are doing. But I want to end on a positive note and like circle back to Vermont, because these are the Vermont birds here circled, because we have one Vermont bird that's still going. He did not get influenza, and he's still going. It's that second year dark morph male that was like photographed down in New York. He's alive and well, and these are his complete movements. His current location is shown up here, so he's really far north now. He's moved quite a bit the last couple weeks. He spent a little bit of time in Vermont and New York again this past winter, but primarily spent a lot of time in southern Quebec, just north of the Vermont border.
Hey Neil, there's a question about, somebody read it here, late season stragglers. One of our Vermont birds came back to Vermont in June, right? Like, so there was definitely some late season birds that weren't going back to their breeding grounds right away, right?
Yeah, let me go back to, so this bird here, this bird in red that, died near Montreal in June. The bird dipped into Vermont right before it died in June, which is pretty cool. I mean, it's like, what the heck is that bird doing way down there in June? We don't really know. I mean, it's a young bird that probably has something to do with it, but why these birds came all the way back south, like, I have no idea. So this bird wasn't really a straggler. I mean, it was all the way up in breeding habitat and then came all the way back down. But I'm sure, like, we know that there are some actual stragglers too, some birds that just kind of initiate migration super late and just stay on the wintering ground super late. But, this bird had already been to Newfoundland, or not Newfoundland, but Labrador already, and then came all the way back and just barely dipped down into Vermont again. So really weird. Like, we don't really know what's going on there or why that bird is doing that.
I think it was the second bird in Vermont that's been seen in June, at least according to eBird. So like, it's definitely not a common thing.
Yeah, for sure. Back to the bird that's, still alive. Just to put a little more meat on that bone. This map's a little dated now, but this is that bird that's still cooking, still going. So I made this map back in December, but it shows like the location where the bird spent most of the summer. So from kind of early July to early October, the bird was in Labrador. It'll be interesting to see where the bird settles this summer. He's kind of up here in northeast Quebec in a similar area to where he spent a little bit of time last summer, but he's still moving around right now, so we don't really know where he's going to settle. But exciting to have this bird still going, and maybe he'll spend a little more time in Vermont next winter. We'll see. That's all I have for you guys. I want to thank everyone a lot. I know I talked for a long time, but hopefully this was all informative for everyone. I got some links down here. You can follow us on social media. We have a Facebook page. Feel free to email me if you have questions, and we'll take some questions now. But I just wanted to thank Vins again for putting up the money for a few of the transmitters we put out. It was really not, like, I didn't really talk about it, but Vermont is the furthest east we've put transmitters on birds during winter. So that's just really nice, a nice piece of our movement puzzle that we filled in by having some really far eastern birds represented in our database. Would love to get more. We tried to catch more birds. My phone's blowing up because people are following me right now. But we tried to put a few more transmitters on birds this past winter. Jim was there, he knows, but we just hardly saw any. We trapped for 2 days and we only saw 2 rough-legged hawks, period. and we were not able to catch any of them. So we tried to put more transmitters out in Vermont this past winter, but there were just so few birds, we just weren't able to do it. But as time and funding allows, like perhaps we'll try to get back to Vermont again at some point and get some more transmitters there. But just want to thank Vince for helping us out there and for hosting me today for this talk. So thanks everyone, and I'm happy to maybe answer a few more questions now if people have more questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Neil. Super, super interesting. There are a couple questions in the chat. I don't know if you can read them. It'd be easier than me reading them to you, but
let's see.
We can also have people come off mute and just ask their questions too. So
yeah, I'll go kind of in reverse order here. That might be easiest for me. So most common cause of raptor deaths. I mean, for us, it's avian influenza, but that's just in the last year or two. Prior to that, it was a whole slew of things that we were seeing with rough-legged hawks. In terms of raptors in general, I mean, it's highly variable. Certainly, I mean, something that's been surprising for us is how often rough-legged hawks we think are preyed upon. Typically, we implicate great horned owls in this. Like the birds are roosting somewhere for the night, and that's where they die. And for a lot of these, we're just assuming that it's great horned owls that are predating them, because like we get there and we find nothing but a transmitter and some feathers, so like the bird has been consumed. So predation. We have had some birds like starve to death, and I'm sure that happens. It certainly happens with younger birds, like birds that aren't very experienced and are still figuring out how to hunt and forage on their own. Other bird, we haven't really seen this in our rough-legged hawks, but other raptors are getting hit by cars a lot. So there's a lot. It's tough. It's tough being a bird. They don't have a lot of the cozy amenities that we have. They're out there every day, just trying to survive. Yeah, good question though. Up to a question from Brian. Species like northern goshawk seem so different in Eurasia compared to North America in terms of habitat and behavior. Are rough-legged hawks in Eurasia significantly different, in my opinion? But can we distinguish them like by looking at them? Good question, Brian. I'm actually not. There are like different subspecies of rough-legged hawks. I am very much less familiar with Eurasian rough-legged hawks, but I think they are phenotypically different. Like when I'm scrolling through images in the Macaulay library and I don't know like where the pictures were taken, I'll often just click on bird and be like, oh, that bird looks weird. And it's a bird that was photographed in like Japan or Europe or something. So I think there are certainly phenotypic differences. And we also know that there's essentially no dark morphs in Eurasia, which is super interesting. There's, a pretty significant of the North American population is dark, especially in the east. 2 of our 5 Vermont birds were dark, but there's essentially no dark birds in Eurasia. We don't really know why. Something we hope to figure out at some point. But yeah, what were the other 5 raptor species in our distribution study? So in my master's work, when we looked at Christmas bird count data and distribution shifts, pretty much every single species, all 6 species showed a range shift further north. They were just varying degrees of shift. So we did rough-legged hawk, red-tailed hawk, American kestrel, prairie falcon, northern harrier, and golden eagle. Those were the 6. They were 6 that were kind of common in our local study area. So those were the 6 that we looked at, and yeah, all of them showed range shifts further north. Just cranking through the question. Well, yeah, someone asked, how do they contract influenza? So again, we don't really know, but for some of the birds like in the Dakotas, folks went out to like retrieve the birds because we knew they were dead from the movement data. And like they would find a dead rough-legged hawk, and then, there'd be a couple dead geese laying around them. But geese were dying by the tens of thousands last spring in the Great Plains. And so we're just assuming that they're scavenging those goose carcasses. We know rough-legged hawks scavenge. And if you can imagine being a bird, a predatory bird, and you're flying over North Dakota on migration and you're hungry and there's just like dead free food everywhere, they're probably eating some of that stuff. So that's what we assume they get it from, but really hard to know because we're not there like observing what happens, when the birds die. Let's see, other questions here. Do we have an overlay of temperatures or rainfall that correspond with the travels of the birds? Not directly, but this is something that I'm interested in for my dissertation, particularly snow and temperature in the winter. We want to better understand how individual birds' movement behaviors in the winter are affected by snow cover and temperature. Particularly with this like variation that we see where like some birds can hack it in North Dakota in the winter where it's super cold. Sometimes there's snow on the ground. And then other birds are in places like Texas where there's basically no snow ever. And something that has been found in a lot of other research is that birds that are larger, so in raptors and rough-legged hawks, those are the females, larger birds are able to tolerate potentially these colder temperatures and maybe increase snow cover. If that snow cover is reducing their ability to find food, there's pretty good evidence out there that larger animals can like handle going longer periods of time without eating, which might happen if there's a lot of snow on the ground and birds don't have consistent access to food. So that is something we'll be looking at some point. I'm going back down to, because Mike had a question here. Is it possible to determine from materials on the bills and talons or in fecal material if there are significant levels of agricultural toxins derived from winter prey, perhaps from pesticides or herbicides? That's a good question, Mike. I know like we were talking about rodenticides earlier. A lot of times when folks are looking for rodenticides from like a dead bird, they're looking at like livers, places where those toxins might accumulate in the body. I don't know if they would show up in significant levels on like the bird's bill or talons or in their feces. And also like in the wintertime, in a lot of these places that rough-legged hawks are inhabiting anyway, I don't know how much folks are putting out this kind of stuff directly in the winter. It might be mostly stuff that's kind of residual left over from when the crops were actually growing. But it's a good question. And I don't have a great answer for you there if that would be a good way to sample for that. Someone said, oh, bummer, gunshot. Yeah. We've had, back to kind of causes of death, we've had 3 confirmed rough-legged hawks that have been shot. One of them was recently I got some x-rays back from a bird that was shot in Kansas this winter. So we've had one from Indiana, Kansas, and Washington State, 3 birds that have been shot. We had another bird from Montana that we suspected was shot, but we weren't able to get to the carcass fast enough to be able to determine what happened. People still shoot raptors. It really sucks, but I think it happens more than we would like to think it happens. Particularly, I think particularly in like the Great Plains and in the West, where the population density is a little lower and people can kind of do stuff and get away with it more, I think. So it's a bummer to see, but yeah, it does still happen, unfortunately. Another question from Brian: do we observe many stragglers? I think, Jim, this was the question that you asked me about, wasn't it?
Yep, that's the one.
Cool. Yeah, we've had, I think that Vermont, that one bird that dipped back into Vermont in June was like our most extreme example from the movement data. In the West, we've had some birds like linger on the wintering grounds into like early May. We may have even seen that. Well, actually right now, we still have a couple birds in Wisconsin. They're starting, like most of them are moving, but we've got a couple birds in Wisconsin still. These are mostly younger birds. I think like aside from that one weird bird in Vermont, I think like May is kind of the latest we've seen stragglers on the wintering grounds. Yeah.
A quick follow-up, if I can, on that one. Do you know, is there a specific age at which rough-legged hawks first breed? Like some of the, like osprey, usually it's like third, fourth year or later, bald eagle fifth year or later. Do rough-legged hawks breed in like that first adult season, or is it usually after that?
Yeah, good question. So I can just tell you what a little bit of what we learned like from our movement data. And so we're kind of basing this on what the movement data, what we think the movement data is telling us, right? Because we're not like up there on the breeding grounds where these birds are hanging out. We have seen some young females that appear to be breeding in like their second year. Like they're probably mostly in juvenile plumage still, just starting to molt into that second year plumage. And we see indication from the movement data that some of them are at least attempting to breed. It's easier with the females because they just sit on the nest, right? And their GPS locations are all just like in one spot. And so it's a bit easier to figure out if they're breeding or not. So we've seen that with some young females, which is really cool. I've never seen that personally. Like when I've gone to Alaska and whatnot, I've never seen like a really young bird like that nesting. I think the males get recruited into the breeding population later. I think it takes them longer. We have several younger males now that we've tagged as either juveniles or second year birds. And, you know, some of them like, I think there's a lot of variation is like the short answer, but some of these younger males, I think, take quite a while to recruit into the breeding population. Potentially, you know, a bird that's 4 or 5, 6 years old maybe hasn't even bred yet. But I think that happens more with the males. I think the females are often the more limiting sex. They're the ones pushing the eggs out. They're the ones sitting on the nest. So like they're often the more limiting sex. And in other raptors too, like golden eagles and whatnot, when you see subadults nesting, it's typically the females that are doing that more often than not. And we kind of see a similar thing with these birds. And someone, just a follow up, someone, you know, what the average lifetime is for a rough-legged hawk in the wild, we don't really know. You know, often what we get, you know, average lifetime is probably really short because most of those young birds that come out of the nest die pretty quickly. So if you're talking average, like of the total number of rough-legged hawks that have ever been born, the average lifespan is probably less than 2 years. But if you're talking like once the bird maybe survives its first year, then how long do they live on average? That's a tougher question to answer because we still just don't have a lot of data on that. You know, a lot of these adult rough-legged hawks that we catch and put transmitters on, we have no idea how old they are. They could be 4 years old, they could be 14 years old, and we just don't know. You know, we know from a few like young birds that we've tagged, like known age birds, juveniles or second year birds. We have a bird that was tagged as a second year. I think it's like an 8th year now and it's still alive. The one bird that the transmitter has been going for like 9 years, like that bird was tagged as an adult. So, you know, who the heck knows how old that bird is. It's just really hard to know because it's hard to follow an individual bird throughout the entire course of its life and know exactly how old it is and when it dies. But, you know, I suspect it's certainly possible birds are living into their teens, maybe into their 20s, if it's a really like high quality individual that's living a good life. So I wish we knew more about that, but that's such a hard thing to get at in reality. Great questions. Keep them coming if you got more. No worries if not. Ooh, we got another one. Is there any correlation between distance they migrate and size of the bird? Great question. And it's something that I'm certainly looking at. So several of those, you know, I threw up like 7 hypotheses that might explain why birds migrate different distances. Oh, there's probably like 4 or 5 of those that have something to do with how big the bird is. And so, but like body size in general isn't really like we have a pretty firm understanding that body size has something to do with how far birds migrate from other studies. And again, we already knew in rough-legged hawks that the females are larger. Anecdotally, we see that there tends to be like a higher proportion of females that winter further north, a higher proportion of males that winter further south, and the females are bigger, right? So there's this, the larger birds are migrating shorter distances. but like, why does body size, like, what is it about body size that allows a bird, or that like why does body size influence how far a bird migrates? And like, that's what I'm trying to understand. Does it have to do with their ability to tolerate cold temperatures? Does it have to do with their ability to like survive periods of food limitation? Like maybe there's a week period where there's just really not a lot of access to food, and a larger bird can like handle that, but a smaller bird can't, and they have to move. Does it have to do with some behavioral type stuff, like larger birds are more dominant than smaller birds, and so the smaller birds are forced further south? Does it get back to the prey stuff that I was talking about? Are the larger birds eating different things? Or so with the prey stuff, I think it's something that we hope to get at is like maybe larger birds are eating larger prey, and that somehow is allowing them to migrate shorter distances. Or potentially larger birds are eating a more diverse suite of prey. So they're eating like a lot of different stuff, whereas maybe these smaller birds are a lot more specialized in the type of food that they eat, and that might have something to do with how far they migrate. So, and a lot of these things might have to do with the size of the bird. So hopefully like in another year or so, I'll have like a better answer to that question, but there's a lot of interesting kind of facets to that we're exploring. Are their numbers declining, or are their numbers stable? So the information we have suggests their numbers are declining. Again, some of that might have to do with the fact that birds are wintering further north. But you know, I think the data pretty strongly suggests that their numbers are declining. It's not like, you know, this crazy precipitous decline that maybe some other birds are seeing. But yeah, I think they are declining. It's really tough with rough-legged hawks because their numbers fluctuate a lot from year to year. So anytime you get a species where their numbers are fluctuating so much from one year to the next, it gets a lot harder to detect these population trends because their numbers are fluctuating so much. Carol's asked, might dietary differences run in the family? Might migration distance likewise run in the family? Excellent question. So getting at like the genetics of this, maybe certain birds are genetically predisposed to migrate, you know, farther or shorter. That's great. That, you know, we're not exactly looking at the genetics of it. Other folks have looked at this a little bit, particularly in species that are what we call partial migrants, where some individuals migrate but others don't. And there is like some folks have been doing this with American kestrels, and they're seeing some evidence that there's like this migratory gene where the birds that don't migrate are more likely to produce offspring that don't migrate. The birds that do migrate are more likely to produce offspring that migrate, and there's like assortative mating going on. And so it's partially a genetic thing there. Again, it's not something we're like directly looking at with this study, but it's, you know, I listed like these 7 hypotheses for why migration distance might vary. There's a bunch of other ones that we're not looking at just because we don't have the time and the resources to do that. So certainly genetics could have something to do with it. Another question here, do they exhibit strong site fidelity to either breeding or wintering grounds? Sometimes. A lot of variation here too. Some birds go to the same spot every winter, and they go to just about the same spot every summer. And other birds definitely don't do that. Some birds move around a lot in the winter, go to different spots each winter. I think more so in the summer, you know, we see birds using different sites during the breeding season, particularly in like Eastern North America. We see a lot of birds using different breeding sites from year to year. In Western North America, like in Alaska, we see a little, I would say anecdotally, a little more fidelity to the breeding sites in places like Alaska, but tons of individual variation there. But in terms, like relatively speaking, compared to like red-tailed hawk, for example, less site fidelity in a rough-legged hawk compared to a species like a red-tailed hawk that has pretty high site fidelity, like in summer and winter. All good questions. All right, maybe that's it.
Yeah, it seems like that might be it. I'm sure you've got ways to contact Neil if you think about things that come up and you got more questions. I'm sure he'd love to answer them via email or any other way you can connect with him. Before
Absolutely.
folks start to log off really quickly, I'll put in a plug for Bryce Robinson of the Red-tailed Hawk Project. We'll be giving a presentation in the future as well about his work tracking red-tailed hawks. And Neil knows Bryce quite well, so stay tuned for more stuff like this come up in the future. And thanks again, Neil. This was really great. Some great discussion.
Yeah, no problem. Red-tailed hawks are cool, I guess. People should go to that talk. But yeah, Jim, thanks for having me. Thanks, Vince, for having me. And thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks for all the great questions. Feel free to follow up, email me if you have other questions, but really appreciate everyone's attention. So thanks everybody. We'll see you later.
Thank you, Neil.
Yeah, no problem.